found my way to international tax through a very, very convoluted route. I began my career as a human rights lawyer, and somewhere along the line I wanted a little bit more peace and quiet after several years of activism. And so I moved into domestic taxes. And after a few years in domestic taxes, I found my way into international tax. I suppose as a human rights lawyer, the concept of rights has always been important to me. And fundamentally, international tax is about who, as in which country, gets to tax what. And of course, it's a technical question if you look at all the technical rules. But it is also a question at its heart about rights. So the rights of a particular state to tax what type of income. And it's beyond it being a technical rule. You look also at things to do with the social and economic and development issues that flow when, for example, a country is not allowed to tax a particular type of income. That has, of course, implications for the citizens and for the residents. So even though it's a technical thing, I think I found my way there eventually due to my background in human rights. International tax has evolved a lot over the past few decades. And one of the things that comes to mind is the rise of multilateralism to address global tax issues. So, for example, we've seen the rise of OECD inclusive framework initiatives. We've seen recent developments from the UN. And at the bottom of all of this is countries coming together to look at global tax issues and come up with a sort of harmonious way of addressing these issues. Not that it works all the time, but what we do see is rather than each country trying to plow their own way to solve particular issues that affect them, we do see a rise in multilateralism trying to address these issues on a global scale. Multilateralism has its limits, of course, because if we take, for example, the OECD Inclusive Framework recent proposals, at the start of the whole discussion, there was a lot of talk about each country having its own vote and them having the need for unanimity across the board. But of course, we've seen that that's not possible, because at the end of the day, there will, of course, be conflicting rights between different states. And what we have seen and what has led now to, for example, further discussions at the UN is the sense that certain types of countries, for example, developing countries, are not getting an equal say in the debate and are also not having their needs met with the current proposals on the table. So yes, multilateralism is good, but it does have its limits because you can't satisfy everyone. If I think of the accomplishment I'm most proud of, I think two things come to mind. The first is the work that I do in Africa. So for example, setting up the Africa Tax Symposium, which is now in its 9th year and which has grown to be one of the leading global conferences on taxation in Africa. And the second thing I'm most proud of is the work that I do mentoring young up-and-coming professionals, not just in the tax world, but also beyond the tax world. My motivation to set up the Africa Tax Symposium, I'll have to take you back to 2015. Around that time, the OECD was rounding up the BEPS actions, and that was 15 action points dealing with different areas of taxation where things needed to change. And what was striking about a lot of these is that many of the proposals did not touch issues affecting developing countries in Africa. And what I immediately saw was that there was a gap. There was a gap in a space where African policymakers, African tax practitioners, African taxpayers could sit together and discuss the issues that are germane to their own continent and not wait for another body outside of Africa to discuss their issues and come up with solutions for them. So I thought, why don't we put together an annual conference, a symposium, where we would get together all the tax practitioners in Africa from all sectors to discuss issues that are relevant for Africa in the global setting. Regarding the future of international tax, I think we are actually at quite an interesting place. Why do I say that? Of course, you've been following the debates at the UN for the UN to get a more prominent role in international tax policy making, which is something that a lot of developing countries care about. On the other hand, we have the OECD, which wishes to maintain its role, which it has had for decades now, in setting the international tax agenda. So we're having these two very, very important bodies looking at how international tax policy making will look in the future. So there's a lot of change afoot. How will it look? We don't know. We know that things are going to change. The extent of the change, we're not yet sure. But one thing that is clear is that there's going to be a louder voice, a bigger voice for developing countries when setting the international tax policy agenda. That for sure we know it will happen. In what form it will happen, we don't know yet. What advice would I give to someone starting a career in tax? The first thing I would say is don't be in a hurry to specialize. As much as possible, try to work in as broad a field of tax as possible until you find out which area works best for you and where you are best suited. And then only then should you think of specializing. I would also advise work hard. There's no getting away from that. Also develop your character, your skills, and your temperament. And the final piece of advice that I would give is make sure you have interests outside of work. Don't let work be your everything. My interests outside of work include playing chess, playing the piano, writing poetry, collecting whiskies. I also write a popular blog on single malt whiskies. To be a leader in this field entails a few things. First, remaining current with what's happening in the tax world, operating with empathy, staying curious, insisting on the highest quality standards, and continuing every day to invest and maintain your professional network. And how you do that is by seeking continually to add value to your network.